Have you ever had that quiet, unsettling moment where something inside you doesn't feel entirely yours? Not in a dramatic way, not like something is wrong, but more like a subtle misalignment, like you're living a life that makes sense on the outside, yet feels strangely distant on the inside. Most people ignore that feeling. They call it stress, or confusion, or just one of those phases. And life continues. Days pass, routines repeat, conversations happen, smiles are exchanged. But beneath all of it, something remains untouched, unquestioned. Because questioning it would change everything. From the moment you were young, you were shaped, quietly, consistently, not just by your family, but by expectations, by reactions, by what was rewarded and what was rejected. You learned what made people comfortable. You learned what made you accepted. And without realizing it, you began to build something. Not yourself, but a version of you. A version that fit. A version that worked. A version that avoided conflict, gained approval, and kept things stable. And over time, that version became so familiar that it started to feel real. But here's the uncomfortable part. Familiar doesn't always mean true. There comes a moment, usually not loud, not dramatic, when something shifts. It might happen during silence, or exhaustion, or after a conversation that leaves you thinking longer than usual. And suddenly a thought appears. What if this isn't really me? Not everything, not completely, but enough to make you pause. Enough to make you notice the difference between what you feel and what you show. And that's where it begins, not with answers, but with awareness, because once you see it, so even slightly, you can't fully unsee it. The strange thing is, this process didn't happen to you overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. No one sat you down and said, "This is who you need to become." It was more subtle than that. It was in the way people reacted when you expressed certain emotions, the way silence followed honesty, the way approval followed compliance. Little by little, you started to understand something important. Some parts of you were welcomed, others were not. And like anyone trying to belong, you adjusted. You softened certain thoughts. You held back certain reactions. You learned to filter yourself before you even spoke. At first, it felt like adaptation, but over time, it became automatic. You stopped noticing the difference between what you felt and what you allowed yourself to express. And eventually, something even deeper happened. You stopped asking what you truly felt in the first place, because it was easier that way. Easier to move forward, easier to avoid tension, easier to maintain relationships. But there's a cost to that kind of ease. When you consistently ignore parts of yourself, they don't disappear. They wait. They stay beneath the surface, quiet but present. And sometimes they show up in unexpected ways, in a feeling you can't explain, in a reaction that feels stronger than it should, in a sense that something inside you is out of alignment, not broken, just disconnected. And that's the part most people misunderstand. They think something is wrong with them, when in reality something true has simply been ignored for too long. And when that truth starts to rise again, it doesn't come as clarity. It comes as discomfort, as restlessness, as questions you didn't plan to ask. But once those questions appear, they don't leave easily. At some point, the discomfort becomes too consistent to ignore. It's no longer just a passing feeling. It begins to follow you. In quiet moments, in conversations that feel slightly off, in decisions that should feel right, but don't. And that's when the deeper realization starts to form. Not all at once, but piece by piece. You begin to notice patterns, how you respond in certain situations, how you say things you don't fully mean, how you agree, even when something inside you hesitates. And the more you observe, the clearer it becomes. You've been operating on something that was built, not discovered, a structure formed over time, carefully shaped by what worked, what was accepted, what avoided rejection. And again, none of this was intentional. It was survival. It was adaptation. It was learning how to exist in a world that doesn't always make space for honesty. But the moment you start seeing it, everything changes. Because now, you can't pretend it's natural. You can't fully go back to not noticing. And that creates tension. a quiet internal tension between what you've been and what might actually be true. And this is where many people stop, not because they don't care, but because going further requires something difficult. It requires letting go of certainty, of identity, of the version of yourself that has been carrying you for years. And that's not easy, because even if that version isn't fully true, it's familiar, and familiarity feels safe. But staying there comes with a different cost, the cost of never fully knowing what's underneath. And that question, what's underneath, doesn't disappear. It waits until you're ready to face it. What makes this realization difficult isn't just the truth itself, it's what it asks from you. Because once you begin to see that parts of you were shaped, constructed, adapted, you naturally start to wonder, what's actually mine? And that question doesn't come with an immediate answer. There's no clear line separating what's real from what was learned. It's not like removing a layer and suddenly finding something pure underneath. It's more complex than that, more subtle. You start noticing moments instead, small ones, when you react differently than usual, when you choose silence, but not out of fear, when you express something honestly, even if it feels unfamiliar. And those moments feel different, not louder, not more intense, but more grounded, less performative, less calculated, almost like you're not trying to be anything at all, just present. And that's where something begins to shift. Not externally, but internally. You begin to trust those moments, even if they're small, even if they're inconsistent, because they feel closer to something real, something unfiltered. But this process isn't linear. There are times you'll fall back into old patterns, times when the familiar version takes over again. And that's okay, because this isn't about removing who you've been. It's about understanding it, seeing it clearly, without judgment, without forcing change. Because the more you force it, the more it becomes another performance, another version. And that's not the point. The point is awareness. And with awareness, something quiet but powerful happens. You stop automatically becoming what's expected and start noticing what's actually there. There's a common assumption that once you see all of this, everything becomes clear, that you'll suddenly know exactly who you are, what you want, how to act. But that's not how it works. In fact, the opposite tends to happen first. Things feel uncertain, undefined, like the structure you relied on isn't as solid as you thought, and that can feel uncomfortable, because certainty, even if it's not entirely true, feels stable. But here's something most people don't realize. That uncertainty isn't a problem. It's space. Space that wasn't there before. Space where you're no longer automatically responding in the same ways. Space where you can pause, observe, choose. And that space is where something real begins to form. Not as a fixed identity, but as a more honest way of being. Less about who you should be, and more about what actually resonates. And this doesn't mean rejecting everything from your past. Not every adaptation is false. Some of it is useful, some of it is meaningful. But now, instead of accepting it automatically, you get to see it and choose what stays and what doesn't. And that shift, subtle as it is, changes everything. Because now you're no longer completely identified with the version you've been. You can step back, you can question, you can adjust, not to become someone new, but to stop being something you were never meant to fully be. And that's where a different kind of stability begins, not based on certainty, but on awareness. And then at some point, something settles, not in a dramatic way, not like a final answer, but like a quiet understanding. You begin to see that this process isn't about finding a perfect version of yourself or reaching some final state where everything makes sense. It's not about becoming someone else. It's about removing what was never fully yours and seeing what remains. And what remains isn't always clear, but it's real. And there's a difference between clarity and truth. Clarity feels complete. Truth feels grounded. Even if it's still unfolding, you start to move differently, not because you've figured everything out, but because you're no longer moving automatically, There's more awareness in your choices, more presence in your actions, and less pressure to perform, to fit, to maintain an image. And with that, something else changes. The way you relate to yourself. There's less judgment, less urgency to fix everything, and more willingness to simply observe, to understand, to allow things to take shape naturally. And maybe the most important realization is this. You were never completely lost. You were just layered, covered by expectations, patterns, adaptations. And now, those layers are becoming visible. Not all at once, but gradually. And that's enough, because this isn't about arriving somewhere. It's about seeing clearly. And once you begin to see clearly, even just a little, everything starts to shift, not outside, but within. And that changes more than anything else ever could.